All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today's episode is about Billie Jean Horton, and she is known as the widow of country music for very good reasons, so stick around. But first, I've got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. Let's see here. This weekend, April 26th, I'll be at Crawdads on the Lake in Folsom opening for the Cruz Brothers, so get your tickets for that. May 1st, I'm at Esplanade at Turkey Creek. May 3rd, I'm at the Sutter Club in downtown Sacramento. May 10th, I'm at Rancho Roble Vineyards in Lincoln. May 31st, I'm at the Reno River Festival. And then into June here, we've got June 8th, I'm at the Knights Ferry Art and Music Festival in Knights Ferry. It's between Oakdale and Sonora, California. And then the 14th, I'm at the Colusa County Fair. And June 20th, I'll be back at Red Bus Brewing. So come on out and catch a show. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler&Co_marketing. And tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. All right, so Billie Jean Horton is one of these characters in country music that kind of floats under the radar for, in history. Like, not a lot of people know who she is now, but she was connected to all kinds of crazy events and people, and, her mark has been left on country music forever. So it starts off, there's a bunch of characters in this, a few of which we've talked about in the past. The first of which is Hank Williams. So, timeline starts 1923. Hank Williams is born in Mount Olive, Alabama. Then, a couple of years later, just so you kind of know the ages of these people and kind of how close they are. So, 1923, Hank Williams is born. 2 years later, in 1925, Johnny Horton is born. And we haven't done an episode on Johnny Horton yet. And we'll probably give him his own episode at some point. But okay, so keep that in mind. Johnny Horton's born in 1925. Then 1932, so 9 years after Hank Williams is born, Johnny Cash and Farron Young are born in 1932. And Farron Young, you will remember, was the guy that gave Willie Nelson his big break. And then a year later, in 1933, you have Billie Jean Jones. She's born Billie Jean Jones, so she's 10 years younger than Hank Williams. And so she's just a year or two younger than Johnny Cash and Farron Young. Okay, so 1933, she's born. And so as we're entering the 1940s, so Hank Williams is getting his life going. We did a full episode on Hank Williams, and he's starting to kind of rise to fame. And then that kind of story arc, because Hank dies in 1953 when he's only 29 years old. So by the time we hit 1950, he's rip-roaring in the middle of his career. His marriage to Audrey is tanking. His drugs and alcohol use is just out of control. And he's getting, fired from the Opry. Then he's getting brought back later. Like Hank's world is just a complete roller coaster at this point. So, 1951. Farron Young is kind of, he's not, oh no, he's starting to rise to fame at this point. He's not super well known, but he's around. He's on the Opry. He's on the Louisiana Hayride, which was kind of a competitor to the Opry at the time. And, you know, he's got hits on the radio and things are starting to kind of build for him. But he's, like I said, he's kind of a young unknown. Now, Farron Young makes the mistake. Well, okay, so Farron Young, and it's unclear exactly how they met, but just at a show or something. But Billie Jean starts dating Farron Young when she's like 18. And before that, when she was 16, she got married and had a kid. And the order of that is unclear to me. But by the time she's 18, she has been, like, she's in the middle of a divorce and she has a kid. Now, her divorce was not finalized at this time. She was married to a guy, Harrison Eshelman, I think was his name. And they got, like I said, they got married when she was 16. He was a little bit older, but their marriage falls apart pretty quick. And so as their marriage is crumbling, the divorce isn't final. She's out dating and she's, you know, they're separated and she's dating Farron Young. And the story takes a bit of a turn here because, and there's a couple of different versions. I found two different accounts of kind of how they met. One version of it is that it was at Farron Young's Opry debut, and this interaction happens backstage. The other version of it I've heard is that this was actually in Hank Williams' house. Either way, so one version of the story is they go to Hank Williams' house. They're showing him, or Hank is showing off his gun collection to Farron Young and his date, Billie Jean Jones. And Hank and Billie Jean have a lot of chemistry almost immediately. Now, remember, this is in the phase where Hank's marriage to Audrey has just crumbled. And it's right around the same time that so remember when Hank's marriage ended, he had a brief fling with Bobby Jett when he got her pregnant. And so, but he doesn't know that yet, I don't think. So it's kind of between Bobby Jett, or right after Bobby Jett, that he ends up meeting Billie Jean. And supposedly they're in his house going over his gun collection. He has, you know, he kind of likes this really cute 19-year-old redhead that is just as much into his outdoorsiness and his guns and his hunting and his fishing. You know, she was kind of that type of girl. Well, Hank loves that. She leaves the room and Hank points one of those guns at Farron Young and is like, if you don't marry that girl, I'm going to do it. And Farron Young is basically like, you can have her. The other version of the story, which is more fun to believe, but it sounds a little bit less true, is that same interaction happened in the backstage of the Opry, but basically Hank chased Farron Young into the bathroom and pulled a gun on him and was like, hey, I'm taking your girlfriend. That one seems a little bit more far-fetched to me, but there are people out there that will say it's true. Either way, there's a gun involved, and Hank Williams swoops poor Farron Young's girlfriend like right out from under him. And Billie Jean just thinks that's great. So her and Hank, you know, fall in love immediately. And they get married. Now remember, in Hank's life at the time, that is a pretty contentious deal because his marriage to Audrey fell apart. And as, you know, I want to be careful to not, like, you know, harp on anybody too hard here. But from all accounts, Audrey and Hank were awful to each other. Like, especially towards the end. There's accounts that, like, you know, I talked about it in the Hank Williams episode that he, like, fired a gun through a door into a bathroom that she was in. But then I've heard other accounts where people are like, yeah, they had the kind of marriage where they were shooting guns at each other. And it's like, that implies that it went both ways. And, I mean, and Hank was cheating on Audrey. Audrey was cheating on Hank. It was just this toxic bomb going off. And so much so that, okay, so then he gets divorced and then he, you know, gets Bobby Jett pregnant. Bobby Jett and Billie Jean have, like, I think they meet once, or there's a little bit of a contention there. But by the time that happens, Hank's already committed with Billie Jean. And so when Hank gets married again, remember, Hank finds out that Bobby Jett is pregnant and agrees to raise the kid. Like, he says, yep, I'm going to adopt the kid. I'll take full custody. That was the agreement, and Billie Jean is in on that agreement. So it's kind of, it sets up this assumption that Billie Jean was the kind of person who was going to marry Hank Williams and be willing to raise this other woman's kid going forward. But obviously, like I said, that falls apart when Hank dies. But that seems to have been her intention, was to, and remember, she has a kid from a previous marriage at this point too. But that was the intention. She was going to marry Hank. They're going to raise those two kids together and move on into the future. Well, they get married. Now, when they get married, the timeline on this is a little funky too, because she has been in the middle of getting divorced this whole time. And the divorce from Eshelman, even though she was dating Farron Young and Hank Williams in the middle here, her divorce isn't finalized until like 11 days after she gets married to Hank Williams. And remember, they did that with 3 ceremonies. They did one private ceremony. They did one private ceremony. And then they sold tickets to 2 sold out crowds, like 28,000 people or something. So like they did a show and then they did like a marriage ceremony at the end. So everybody knows that Billie Jean and Hank Williams have been married. And then that was in, I think they got married in October. Okay, so this is October of 1952. And then like 2 months later, New Year's Eve, Hank dies in the backseat of his Cadillac. Now, at the time, the nation sort of, responds, obviously. And remember that Hank's his most famous kid at the time is Hank Jr., who Audrey kept and had sort of, I don't want to like I said, I don't want to throw too much shade at people, but she does seem to have wielded Hank Jr. as a bit of a weapon on Hank. Like she was only allowing him to see him under certain conditions. And like, I found one account of one of their final meetings was at like an airport, and Hank basically gave Audrey one last chance. He was like, listen, he's like, if you don't come back to me, I'm going to marry Billie Jean. And Audrey was basically like, well, go do it then. And so he does. And, and then if you remember, Audrey is in the middle of her own music career too. Like she's kind of riding the wake of Hank Williams. Like she's out there doing the Mrs. Hank Williams thing. And so like almost all of her fame and credits comes from being attached to Hank Williams. And remember that she was kind of getting the Yoko Ono treatment where everybody knew that you're just here because, you're married to Hank, but she can kind of sing. But like, and I've listened to some of her stuff. It's not terrible, but people trashed her at the time. I mean, she can carry a tune, but the fans did not receive that well. And that was already starting before Hank died. Like she had continued performing. So then Hank dies. Now, this is where things get messy because immediately Billie Jean, even though they were only married for that short amount of time, she jumps right into the role of like protecting Hank's legacy. Like she doesn't seem to have too much interest in it. Well, okay. Initially, she starts doing performances billed as Mrs. Hank Williams. And that's great if you're not Audrey and Lily, because Hank's mom, Lily, was still alive at the time. So you've got this 19-year-old beautiful redhead running around telling the world she's Mrs. Hank Williams and performing. Well, Audrey's still trying to do that. That's still her source of income, is being billed as Mrs. Hank Williams. So there's this weird moment where like, as the Williams estate is getting hacked into pieces and divided up into all these different people, they basically, Lily and Audrey, pay Billie Jean $30,000, and this is in 1953. They pay her $30,000 to stop billing herself as Mrs. Hank Williams. So she continues, performing, and like she has like one song that like hits the top 40, I think, on the Billboard charts, but like she never gets, blasted into fame as a musician, but she stays involved. But yeah, so she gets paid $30,000 to just stop taking performances as Mrs. Hank Williams. And so, that's a bummer because Audrey squeezes that lemon as hard as she can. For years, she's out there as, Mrs. Hank Williams, and kind of that also helps kind of thrust Hank Jr. into the spotlight later. I mean, for better or worse, Hank Jr. is like I said, he would go on to have his own crazy life and career. But as a kid, that was tough. He was getting shoved on stage and getting kind of pushed out into the spotlight, long before he was probably ready for it. So, but this is all happening. Okay, so they pay $30,000 to Billie Jean to stop billing herself as Mrs. Hank Williams. And she seems to take that okay. There was also something about, like, at the time, she was the only person who knew where one of Hank's famous, like, his favorite horse was. It was like a Tennessee walking horse that he had. And, he had been separated from Audra for a while here. It's not like all his stuff was at her house. He had all of his things somewhere else. So Billie Jean was the only one who knew where that horse was. And there was a couple of saddles and some suitcases with, like, some specific clothes in it. So as part of that $30,000, Billie Jean had to give back the horse and the saddle and the clothes and stop billing herself as Mrs. Hank Williams, which she does do. And here's the other part of this that makes it weird. Lily, Hank's mom, immediately starts challenging the validity of her marriage to Hank, because remember that her divorce from the first guy wasn't finalized until like 11 days after her and Hank got married. Now, that would become a legal battle that stretches on for a long time, long after Lily dies. But, so there's already, like, you can see, like, where the battle lines are forming with, like, the Williams family on this side and Billie Jean over here. And then Bobby Jett in a different corner, because remember that daughter that Bobby Jett has that is born, like, a week after Hank dies, that kid ends up getting put up for adoption. Because after Hank dies, somehow, like, the agreement is that child was going to get given to Lily, not to Billie Jean. And I don't exactly understand how that shook down. But Lily gets custody of her for a second, then Lily dies, and that kid ends up getting put up for adoption by a sister or somebody. Like, some other family member doesn't want anything to do with that kid. She gets put up for adoption. So you've got that kid that doesn't even find out that she's one of Hank's heirs till, like, 20-something years later. So that, fire is burning in the background. And you've got Audrey and Hank Jr. and Lily leading the charge, kind of fighting to secure the estate kind of a thing. So, but Lily dies soon after. Well, Billie Jean doesn't seem to spend too much time letting this bog her down very far. So after she gets that settlement, she kind of walks away from the Williams, saga, sort of. But she meets and quickly marries Johnny Horton. Now, Johnny Horton was his own crazy character, and they get married. So Billie Jean and Johnny Horton get married like 9 months after Hank dies. It's really quick. It's like later in 1953. And Johnny Horton adopts the Billie Jean's kid from the previous marriage. So, and then they go on and they have like 3 kids together, or 2. They have the previous kid and then 2 of their own. So, and she immediately jumps into being like on his team. Like, she's helping with networking. She's helping, cut deals. She's helping with booking stuff. She really, she's not just kind of sitting around idly. She's really a good force in his life. And so Johnny Horton starts getting all these, successes. Let's see here. So now we're into 1953. Okay. So now 1954, as just kind of a side note to keep track of the timeline here. So that's 1953 that they get married. So she's married to Johnny Horton through the 50s here. So everything that happens during the 50s, you can imagine that Billie Jean is married to Johnny Horton. So during this time, Johnny Horton is close friends with Johnny Cash. Like, they meet each other through the Louisiana Hayride thing, and their careers are kind of running side by side. They become really close. And so does Farron Young later. Like, Farron Young and Johnny Cash become really close. So, but there's not a lot of overlap between Farron Young and Johnny Horton, it doesn't look like, but Johnny Cash is the pin that kind of ties it all together. So, and you can remember that this is also let's see here. I don't want to jump too far ahead in the timeline. So Fair and Young starts to get some success in 1954, 1955. Okay. So approaching 1960, Johnny Horton really kind of breaks into fame with the Battle of New Orleans, like that famous song from 1959. And like North to Alaska is in there, and like he's really building momentum. Then, okay, so during this time, for whatever reason, this something that I can't quite get my head around, Johnny Cash, who is a known Christian, like he's super tied, like he was appearing during, like he was doing shows with Billy Graham, like he's super involved with Christianity. Somehow, part of his story also involves him and Johnny Horton performing seances together, trying to contact the spirit of Hank Williams, which sounds strange to me, but apparently they did it on more than one occasion. And this is in the late 50s, early 60s. So like Ouija boards are a big thing. There was kind of a big obsession with sort of occultism at the time. Like they were kind of riding a cultural wave, but still, that's kind of nuts to have two dudes that, you know, like are very involved Christians doing seances to talk to Hank Williams. And then you add on top of that, Johnny Horton was like known. One of the things that is weird about his death is that he kind of predicted it. So he used to say, he told people all the time that he had a premonition that he would die at the hands of a drunk. That was kind of the level of detail. He just knew he would die at the hands of a drunk. And he, you know, has a history of like kind of uneasiness and kind of, he basically sort of saw his death coming. And he also has a bunch of weird tie-ins with Hank Williams. So like, obviously he's married to Hank Williams' wife, you know, they're his widow, but also the Hank Williams' last performance was at a club in Austin, which I'm not sure if I wrote down here. Oh, the Skyline Club in Austin is what it was called. Okay. So Hank Williams, when he died on that road trip, he had just played a gig at the Skyline Club in Austin, and he was road tripping to his next one. I think it was in Ohio or something. But the Skyline Club in Austin was his last gig. And that's also where Johnny Horton played his last gig. And he gets on the road. And actually, before Hank even died, he had a moment with Billie Jean where she describes him coming in the room looking like he's just shredded. And, you know, I mean, this had been months of him being worn down, and he was, you know, kind of in the throes of the whole interaction with that doctor that was just writing him prescriptions for weird stuff. And he comes into the room. Actually, before this happened, she tells a story about she wakes up and she sees Hank shadow boxing in the corner of their bedroom. And she's like, "Come back to bed. What are you doing?" And he says, "I see Jesus and he's coming for me." So he's like shadow boxing, like somehow that, but like he's the angel of death, I guess. I don't know. But he says, "I see Jesus and he's coming for old Hank." And then like the next day, she's getting ready to go somewhere. She's putting her makeup on, and Hank comes walking in the room, and he just sits down and he's just looking at her. And she says, you know, "What's going on?" And he just said, "I just wanted to look at you one more time." And then that was the last thing he ever said to her. Then he leaves to go on that road trip, and he never sees her again. So plays at the Skyline Club, drives out of there, dies in the backseat of the Cadillac. Then flash forward a few years to 1960. This is 7 years later. November 5th, Johnny Horton does pretty much the same thing. He's been predicting his death the whole time. He said, "I'd die at the hands of a drunk." He was super uneasy about everything, like in the days before this. He plays at the Skyline, drives out of there, and they get hit by a drunk driver in a head-on collision. And there were, I think, 3 or 4 people in the car. Johnny Horton's the only one that dies. So there was, I know Tillman Franks was also in the car, but there were a couple other guys as well. But Johnny Horton dies in 1960 from a drunk driver, once again widowing Billie Jean. So she obviously, her life is thrown into chaos hard once again. And so, but now she's like, she's kind of plugged in with all these people. Like, you can remember that, like, you know, Johnny Cash and Farron Young and Johnny Horton and her, and they're all kind of like buddies. They're all in the same circles. Now, Farron Young, for his part of the story, the last sort of comment about him in this time, like, they're obviously like around each other enough that at some point after this, Farron Young makes the comment to Billie Jean, man, I'm glad I didn't marry you because, like, look what's happening to all your husbands. And, which is like a super messed up thing to say to somebody, especially at that stage. But I don't know if that's a comment on Farron Young's attitude or if that's a comment on their dynamic. Like, were they buddy enough that that was funny? Or was that Farron Young being a bit of a jerk about this whole thing still, you know, all these years later? Because remember, they were just dating. They never got married. Farron Young was just dating Billie Jean, and then Hank Williams just kind of swooped her off of him, you know, a few years before this. So anyway, so Farron Young makes this comment to her. And so that's 1960. Quickly after that, so 1961, this is where just another run into another one of our timelines that we've done. So right after Johnny Horton dies, this is when Willie Nelson shows up on the scene and writes Hello Walls for Farron Young. And so Farron Young is kind of thrown back into the top of the spotlight again. And, you know, he was already kind of famous, but it was definitely a big boost, and it put Willie Nelson on the map. And Willie Nelson would obviously go on to have a famous friendship with Johnny Cash, but he doesn't seem to bounce off of the Billie Jean timeline hardly at all. Like, I can't find any interactions between those two people. But anyway, so Willie Nelson, that story that we did in a previous episode, that's where this bounces off the timeline here. So, then, okay, so this is just kind of a series of famous deaths. Like, country music and music in general went through some turbulent times here because obviously 1953, Hank Williams died. 7 years later, Johnny Horton died. And then a year after that, Patsy Cline, let's see here, no, there was one more. Because before the Patsy Cline, I think it was in 1959. I think it was 59. Yeah. Okay. So in 1959, that's when Buddy Holly died. So Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens and J.P. Richardson, they die in a plane crash in the same few years. So this is like, so 53, Hank dies, 59, Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens die, and then 1960, Johnny Horton dies. And they're all like plane crashes, car accidents, and, you know, like, I mean, obviously Hank was the drug overdose, but that was tough. And so that's the Don Williams writes, you know, American Pie. That song is about Buddy Holly's death and that plane crash. So we'll probably do a video on that one at some point. But anyway, so it's just kind of this, like, famous country music people are just dropping like flies in these crazy tragedies. They're all dying at young ages. And so it is during this time, sometime in late night, I think 59 or early 1960. So Johnny Horton dies, and that obviously throws Billie Jean into another state of chaos. Well, she's still in that same friend group. Like, so, like, this is the time when, like, you know, when Farron Young's like throwing jokes at her, like, oh, I'm glad you and I never got married, you know? And so Johnny Cash, though, seems to have taken a little bit more pity because he ends up financially supporting her briefly. And remember, this is early in the Johnny Cash story. So this is the phase where Johnny Cash is still married to Vivian Liberto. But remember, before that marriage ended, when he's on the road with, you know, he's on the road with the Carter family, and he's doing, you know, like this whole story is still coming together for Johnny Cash. But remember when I said he was doing the rock star thing and he was running around on Vivian? One of the girls he's running around on Vivian with is Billie Jean. So they, you know, and she's like, obviously, she's come to Johnny Cash for support, and he's giving her financial support, but it does turn into a brief romantic relationship also. So now she's, you know, tied together with Farron Young, Hank Williams, Johnny Horton, and Johnny Cash. So, and that relationship, like I said, is short-lived. Johnny's life goes on to get really complicated. He gets divorced from Vivian. Him and June are, their story starts taking off together. So his involvement with Billie Jean is short, but important, I guess, because, that's for this story. So, let's see here. That's 1960-ish. And then 1961. So 1961, she does release a song called Ocean of Tears, and that's the one that hits the top 40. So this is, after she's sort of known as being the widow of both of these guys at this point. It's not just riding the coattails off of Hank or Johnny Horton. Like she's kind of become known through both of those things. And then soon after that, this just as another example of just tragedy hitting. So that was 61. 1963, Patsy Cline dies. So in that window of time where like she's involved with Johnny Cash, right as Willie Nelson gets to Nashville, but that kind of goes south quick. But then Willie Nelson is selling a song to Farron Young. That puts him in the spotlight. Soon after that, Willie Nelson sells a song to Patsy Cline, and that kind of throws him into fame as well. And then just a couple of years later, Patsy Cline dies. So like it's all like this hot potato of fame and tragic deaths just popping all over the country music scene this whole time. And then, and at this stage of the game, Billie Jean has spent years at this point contesting, like she enters some legal battles to be recognized as part of Hank Williams' estate. Because the settlement she took was to give back the horse and the saddles and the stuff and stop billing herself as Mrs. Hank Williams. She didn't give up her rights to anything else. She just had to meet, like, in her mind, that's what she still is, rightfully owed part of the Williams estate. Well, obviously Audrey wasn't going to take that sitting down, so this becomes a gigantic legal battle. And it lasts for years. And to the point where, so in 1968, so this is 8 years after, this is 8 years after Johnny Horton's death. She's still fighting with the Williams estate. So then she gets married again to a guy named Kent Berlin, who was I think he was like an insurance representative. So he was just kind of a corporate guy. But apparently that marriage hits the rocks almost immediately. I can't even really find a solid date for when their divorce gets finalized. It's within like a year or two. But Billie Jean does say that afterwards, like they remained close friends. It's just that he enters the scene as she is knee deep in this legal battle, and she's traveling all around the country with attorneys and stuff. And she's going to different, like challenges in different courts and stuff. Like she's hitting that pretty hard. So you can imagine, as a new guy on the scene, that's a pretty tough marriage to hang in there with, because like you're fully engaged all the time talking about her past husband's estates, and like that's taking up all the bandwidth, and they're not really developing their own relationship. So anyway, so like I said, that marriage does not last for very long at all. And it's not until 1971 that Billie Jean wins the legal battle, because she gets, because basically the challenge was that because her divorce from Eshelman wasn't official at the time of her wedding to Hank, that because that wasn't like, that T was not crossed, that she's not owed anything. That marriage is null and void, and she's not, part of the estate. Well, in 1971, a judge rules that no, she entered the marriage in good faith. The preceding thing, like this is just a filing error, that like she wasn't like with that guy. They've been separated for a long time, and that like she entered the marriage in good faith, fully intending to spend the rest of her life married to that person. So she's awarded part of the Williams estate, which I'm sure stung, because you got to remember that like, if you're Hank Williams Jr. at the time, you're watching the estate, and Hank Williams Jr. is the only, like, theoretically, if they had won, it would have just been Audrey and Hank Williams Jr. after Lily died that were controlling the Williams estate. But now it's Audrey, Hank Jr., Billie Jean, and then Jet Williams, who was Bobby Jet's daughter with Hank Williams, that comes out of nowhere, I think in the 70s, also takes a chunk out of it. So Hank Williams Jr. is just watching the estate just get sliced in half over and over and over again. But anyway, so that's 1971, to the point where, like, you can imagine, and something that kind of sticks in my mind as a little bit treacherous is like so Audrey goes through the trouble of paying 30 grand to get Billie Jean to stop using her name, as Mrs. Hank Williams. Then she goes on and Audrey starts billing herself as Mrs. Hank Williams. And so there's these competing stories going on where, like, on the one hand, Audrey, who the last thing she said to Hank was like, screw you, go marry the other girl, and I'm keeping the kid kind of thing, was like, and they were shooting guns at each other and cheating on each other, and like that toxic soup of a relationship. While I'm sure it was, like, people will still make sure to note that they really did love each other, and Hank and Audrey were a love story for the ages. It was just really toxic towards the end and very chaotic. But that's the marriage that moves on as Mrs. Hank Williams and his son. And they're, while Billie Jean just has to kind of get shuffled off, out of that story, which is kind of weird. So her winning in 1971 was a real kind of, if nothing else, move to acknowledge that she was involved in that story and she doesn't just get written off with a check. But because Audrey goes on, and the other thing too is they make a movie in 1971 maybe? Early 1970s, somewhere in there. MGM makes a movie called Your Cheatin' Heart, and it does not portray Billie Jean well at all. And to the point where Billie Jean sues to stop distribution of that movie, and she wins. So, like, I've never seen that movie, but, like, how bad do you have to portray someone for a legal case like that to win? And be like, yeah, no, you're just slandering this person. That's not how it went. You cannot distribute this movie. Like, and Audrey was the one that really was the storyteller there. So, like, that kind of defines their relationship. Is like, even all those years later, Audrey is just blasting Billie Jean, trying to, like, put her in as bad a light as possible. I mean, there's a chance that I'm sure some people would view Billie Jean as like a kind of this person that bounced from successful guy to successful guy and, like, sort of made her bones by riding the coattails of famous husbands. Like, if you took the least charitable version of Billie Jean's life, you could let yourself believe that she was, like, manipulating these men into bringing her along. And if you did that, and then you see her fighting for portions of the estate, then that's like, she's the evil, gold digging lady. And I'm sure that's what Audrey told herself at the time. But what, at least in my reading of it, seems to be the reality is that Audrey and Hank's marriage falls apart on its own. And Hank did marry Billie Jean with every intention of, like, adopting her kid and raising a family together. And that, that was just tragically cut short by his death. But I don't think Billie Jean is this kind of gold-digging character that she's apparently portrayed as in this MGM movie. But like I said, she sues and she wins to stop distribution of that movie. And you can imagine how much money did that cost MGM? First of all, to make the movie and then only get the box office from it and not get distribution rights. Like, that's a lot of money. Because I'm sure people would have picked that movie up. I mean, especially at the time, like the story of Hank's death and everything like that, that was a lot of money that she just stopped them from making by that lawsuit, which I'm sure pissed off a lot of people. But so, as another tragedy, adds to the story here. So, like I said, Johnny Horton died in 1960. And then country music moves on. And so you've got Johnny Cash's career taken off, Farron Young's career taken off, Willie Nelson enters the picture. They're all friends. They're all, connected and hanging out together. Well, Farron Faron Young's career kind of falls off. And he had been fighting like health issues and depression and anxiety and the whole thing the whole time through the 80s and into the 90s. So while Faron Young starts our story off by dating Billie Jean, his story ends in 1996 when he commits suicide in Nashville. Now, Faron Young was so close with Johnny Cash that his ashes are spread at Johnny Cash's house. Like Johnny Cash, his house is on a lake, and they spread Faron Young's ashes in that lake. Like that's so these 5 people, their stories are so intertwined that even though Faron Young kind of stays on the periphery towards the end, when he does die, his ashes are spread at Johnny Cash's house. And then Johnny Cash died in 2003 from I found a couple of I can't remember exactly it was like diabetes related. And and he died, him and June Carter died within months of each other. So, but Billie Jean, as far as I can tell, is still alive. And last thing I can find is that she's in like a nursing home in Shreveport, Louisiana, which, I mean, that would be a crazy person to talk to, because the way her life just bounced off all these different people and like the mark that she left on country music and what a story. I mean, back to the Johnny Horton thing, like there's so much weird juju going on there. Like him dying after performing at the same club while being married to the same woman, also in a Cadillac when he died. Like that, him and Hank Williams, that's tying after he'd been doing seances with Johnny Cash trying to talk to Hank Williams. And he also predicted that he would be killed at the hands of a drunk. Like that, there's a lot of question marks there. Like how in the world does that happen? And imagine being Billie Jean at the time when she watched it happen to both of those guys. Oh, that's a crazy story. Were her husband at the time, which is like, I don't know how you wrap your head around that problem, but she seems to have. And anyway, so she goes on, she wins some legal battles. She's recognized as part of the Williams estate. She manages Johnny Horton's estate after his death and does a great job of like, she's sort of known as this character that sort of protects the legacy of both of those people. And, yeah. And she, like I said, she lived on. She's in her 90s now. And I think as far as I know, she's still alive in Louisiana. So, yeah, that's Billie Jean Horton. So, yeah, so she stuck with the name. Originally, she was born Billie Jean Jones, but she sticks with the name Horton after Johnny Horton's death. So, Billie Jean Horton was just a legend in the country music timeline. So, but anyway, so that's our episode for this week. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.